Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. This is going to be a two-part series, if you call it, a lecture, if you will. We're going to be looking today at the resurrection, specifically the most famous miracle in history, the pinnacle and cornerstone of all of Christianity. And we're going to be looking at both sides. So this video is actually going to be a devil's advocate. I'm going to be arguing, as honestly as I can think of at least, the position of the skeptic. And so in this video, I'm going to be taking on the position of someone who would give the case against the resurrection. I'm going to try to steelman and give the best case against the resurrection that I think is possible and that I think is good. And then in the next video, which I will make shortly after this, I will give the best case for the resurrection that I think can be done. And one is free to watch those, compare, and to come to their own conclusions. Now, a lot of people might be wondering why I would take this route. But I think the idea of looking at the evidence honestly is important. And I think before anyone makes any important life decision, that they really should consider all sides and all possibilities beforehand, and then come to their own conclusions. I think that's the honest way to do epistemology. And we really need to look at all arguments on all sides. And the notion of a devil's advocate actually comes from Christianity. It comes from Catholicism. Whenever the Catholic Church is canonizing a saint, or at least they used to do it this way, they would have a devil's advocate who is called the promoter of the faith, the advocatus diaboli, to come and basically give the case against the saint becoming canonized into heaven, to being beatified. And that's how the idea works. So to use Josh McDowell's analogy, if the resurrection is on trial, if this is evidence that demands a verdict, today I'll be playing the role of prosecutor. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a fedora to really unleash my internet atheist personality. The closest thing I have is an anarchy hat, which has an A. So for the purposes of this presentation, the A will be for atheism in this case. So without further ado, let us get started and look at the case against the resurrection of Jesus Christ, shall we? All right, there we go. All right. I present to you the case against the resurrection of Christ, the devil's advocate. Now, first, I think when we look at any situation for this, especially for the resurrection, and we'll be doing this in both parts, both the for and the negative side, we're going to be looking at three things. One, the prior probability. Two, the historical evidence. And three, the explanatory power and modern repercussions of such theories. So we're going to start off with the prior probability for the resurrection, which is pretty important in this regard. It's not important just like the evidence in a vacuum. We need to look at the context theologically and historically as well. So just for the sake of argument, we're going to grant in this that God exists and that miracles can theoretically happen. So we're not going to say that we have an anti-supernatural bias. We're not going to say people don't rise from the dead because people don't rise from the dead and assume naturalism. We're going to grant, to make it better for the Christian in this situation, that these things are possible. And yet we're still going to say that even granting that, the resurrection may not be the best explanation. All right, so first we should really look at what is bodily resurrection, at least in the Christian sense. Well, in Christianity, the resurrection is not just something that means you're going to live eternally as a disembodied soul. No, it's an embodied existence in the afterlife. But it's not just that you live in a body, it's that you live in the same body. Now, it's a transformed body. It is a body that is incorruptible and perfect, but it's still the original body. God is not discarding your old body and getting a new one. It's the transformation, it's the changing of it. It's not a clone of your old body. But this gets into some really confusing philosophical questions, such as, what about bodies that have been cremated? What about atoms that have been shared by multiple people over the years? When a body rots in the ground and becomes part of the soil and vegetables grow out of the soil or water runs through it, the atoms go through different people. And so the point is, when you break down this on an atomic level, it really gets confusing as to what counts as your body at that point, especially if ashes have been scattered. So even though God is omnipotent, God cannot do, at least in traditional theism, cannot do the logically impossible. And so the argument here is that if resurrection, if the idea of keeping your original body that's going to be transformed to where it's to where it is the actual original body is logically incoherent, then this would basically make the resurrection, no pun intended, dead on arrival, or at least very improbable. And we have no experience with this. And so, yeah, does God have to keep track of every atom, and how many original atoms are needed for it to be the same body? This is comparable to the ship of Theseus, where you have two ships, and every year you take one piece of wood from that ship and put it in a new ship and replace that one with a new piece of wood. after all the wood has been exchanged, which one is the original ship? You could do that with the atoms of a person. How many atoms does it take for you to be the same person? Obviously, it's not just one, because I could, skin cells rub off on people all the time. So how many atoms does it take for it to be considered the same body? These are questions that philosophers argued about, and it just makes the notion of bodily resurrection problematic for anyone who is affirming it. All right. Oh yeah, and here's another slide about that, about these interesting thought questions that St. Augustine talked about the pagans mentioning, is when somebody's body has been eaten by another man who turns to cannibalism on the compulsion of hunger, into whose body will it return at the resurrection? Again, you get these really confusing thought experiments where the answer is not overly clear. All right, but what about Jesus? Let's put aside the question of bodily resurrection. Is there any reason Jesus would be raised from the dead? Now, apologists like to say that Jesus is another category, that we're not just saying that any old person was just raised from the dead. No, Jesus is special. Jesus was exceptional in history. Well, is that really true? Well, first of all, a lot of people will say, well, Jesus was the Messiah, so God has reasons to raise him from the dead to affirm his messianicship. But the issue is that Jesus didn't really fulfill the messianic role in the traditional sense. The Messiah in most Jewish circles, at least the Messiah Bar David, and there might have been a Messiah Bar Joseph as well. The Messiah was supposed to be this military leader who would defeat the Romans or the enemies of Israel and defeat all evil on earth and bring Israel to peace. And that's when God's judgment would come and the kingdom of God would arrive. But of course, Jesus didn't attribute this on earth, at least. And so Christians say, well, he did this in heaven. He's waiting in heaven, and he will come back at some point, even though we're still waiting today. And most of the prophecies Jesus allegedly fulfilled do not actually refer to the Messiah. So when Jesus, for example, when Matthew has Jesus's family taken to Egypt and then quotes the verse that says, "Out of Egypt I shall call my son," that passage was not originally referring to the Messiah. It's in a different context and reference to Israel. Same with Judas selling Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, or Mark talking about a prophet arriving. All of these are in different contexts to which the New Testament authors then saw and tried to make fit. So scholars like Mark Goodacre would call this history traditionalized, or history scripturalized, that they are taking historical events and are trying to put them back onto the Old Testament to make them fit, rather than Jesus fulfilling these naturally. And in the few places where these actually are fulfillments of messianic prophecy, or prophecies that were considered messianic at the time, they are very contrived and done that. So, for example, the Messiah was supposed to be born in Bethlehem, but we get two different stories in Matthew and Luke. Matthew has Jesus go during the reign of Herod to be born in Bethlehem, and then has to flee from Herod and go into Egypt, whereas Luke doesn't have the Egypt story, but he does have the census of Quirinius, and that's always been controversial and generally considered anachronistic, because Josephus tells us that the census happened in 6 AD, whereas both Luke and Matthew say that the census or that Herod died in 4 BC. So both of them want to say that Jesus was born during the time of Herod the Great, but Luke also wants to say that Jesus was born during the census in 6 AD. So Luke has to move the census to the time of Herod the Great, which most scholars would consider an anachronism. And he's doing this specifically to get Jesus to fit, so that he has an excuse to go to Bethlehem. And so if that's true, if the gospel authors have to make Jesus fulfill these prophecies, that is not very good for our priors. We would expect the Son of God, we would expect this God incarnate to actually fulfill legitimate prophecy, not have to force these fulfillments. Whereas if Jesus was some kind of failed cult leader or prophet who had radical disciples who believed he was God, it's not surprising that they would do this anachronistically and retroactively. So that is actually evidence against Jesus being God in this case. Another example would be in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus, in the other Gospels he rides a donkey, but in the Gospel of Matthew, some of the language there implies he could be riding 2 donkeys at the same time, and this is because I believe the passage of Zechariah, which Matthew's trying to make Jesus fulfill, mentions both a colt and a donkey. And so it seems like a very ad hoc kind of justification for that. And so examples like these just show the gospel authors were in great pains to make Jesus fulfill prophecy, which is not what we would expect if he actually did fulfill them. They would be very natural and very predictable, and they wouldn't be random verses in the Old Testament that have nothing to do with the Messiah. Another one people want to talk about is Isaiah 53. That's a reference to Jesus. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was silenced like a lamb. But you can only cherry pick these. And of course, Jesus was not the only person crucified. One could point to any failed messianic leader and say, oh, look, They were pierced and they were trampled over, and they could have died for us as well. And there are places in Isaiah 53 that don't really make sense being Jesus. For example, verse 10 says, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offspring for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days." Now, the confusing thing is Jesus never had children, unless one was to believe the Gnostic Gospels, which came later. Jesus didn't have kids. He was single his whole life, nor were his days prolonged in the traditional sense. He died pretty young at the age of 33. Granted, that was probably middle age back then, but still. So this doesn't seem to fit very nicely with Jesus, unless one wants to take it hyper metaphorically and say that the offspring are not literal offspring. But then it gets into the question of proper exegesis and what was the original interpretation of such passages. So one could say that Jesus is not a good candidate for any of these prophecies, and therefore we should not get excited about having him be exceptional to the rule. And this slide also summarizes that. If you want to look at Helping Jesus Fulfill Prophecy by Richard C. Miller, or James M. Robinson's work on this, where the early Christians were making Jesus fulfill prophecy in this way. Another issue is that Jesus was not really a good moral teacher. He may have been better for his time, but many skeptics will say that, if Jesus was God incarnate and was really sinless, we would expect really surprising teachings that were revolutionary for the time, and we would expect no imperfections. But Jesus advocated, or at least implied, a lot of things that we would today not consider morally permissible in the same sense. So Jesus did not explicitly condemn slavery, for example. Granted, it's hard to see verses where he explicitly states that you should own slaves or do that, but Jesus mentions plenty of parables of slaves and never seems in all of his ministry to be concerned about, yes, you should not own other people. Jesus also condemned divorce in most cases, with the exceptions of sexual morality or abuse. And this is problematic because, especially in Jesus' day, most marriages were arranged. And so people weren't staying with their spouses because they had the free choice to. They were doing it because they were forced to. So Jesus is basically saying that you should stay in these relationships that you may or may not agree with, and the only exception is if you were being, physically harmed. Whereas people today get married for various reasons, and sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes you're not compatible with the person sexually or emotionally for whatever reasons, and so divorce is meant to be a way to leave failing marriages. And Jesus is basically saying, no, you can't do that. Once you get involved, you can't leave. Especially in time where people didn't even freely do these in the first place often. So that is problematic and is not necessarily intuitive. And it also shows that, Christians don't really have any better rates with divorce than non-Christians do. Christians get divorced at roughly the same estimates, which is surprising if Christians are supposed to be changed and actually be different and have their hearts trained with Jesus. You think they would follow his commands a little bit better. But I digress. One could also do the famous incidents of Jesus cleansing the temple, where he fastens a cord and uses it to make a whipping sound. Whether he actually whips people is not explicitly stated, but perhaps it's implied. And of course, he turns over tables and destroys other people's private property, which today would get him, he would be arrested even back then, but today that would certainly be a crime to destroy the private property of someone else, given, Lockean property rights and metaphors like that. And of course, Jesus encouraged people to give up their familial ties and money in order to join him. He says, sell all of your things and join me. Hate your father and mother and love me more. Don't worry about burying your father. Come join me. So this is something that we do see in cult leaders, this idea of shunning people, especially in Jehovah's Witness camps, that you should leave and abandon your family who doesn't agree with the cause and follow me. And that can often be a very dangerous avenue to go down. And of course, Jesus encouraged bad hygiene. In Mark 7, when the disciples don't wash their hands and the Pharisees get on them, and Jesus says, no, worry about the cleanliness of your soul and not what's on the outside. And while the spiritual message is clear here, the issue is that this was before germ theory was discovered. And so people by the hundreds were dying, hundreds, a day. But certainly disease was a big deal back then, especially since they didn't know how proper hygiene worked. They didn't know germs existed. And so for Jesus to say, no, don't worry about washing your hands, even if he meant it in a metaphorical sense, could still set a bad precedent, especially since people were dying and getting sick, and having that good hygiene would save lives. But Jesus encouraging this makes sense if he's just a human with different beliefs and is doing this and doesn't know about germs. But it's very strange if he's God incarnate and would be expected to want the best for people in this sense. And of course, Jesus, the biggest crux to him is that he, according to many scholars like Dale Allison and others, may have mistakenly thought that the end times was near. Now, this is a very extensive topic that I don't have time to get into, but often verses people throw out are during the Olivet Discourse and other places where Jesus seems to imply that he thinks that the end of the world is going to happen in his day, which of course it did not. And so later Christians sometimes try to separate the fall of Jerusalem from the second coming and do this. And we even see this with Jehovah's Witnesses when they predicted the end of the world would happen in 1914 and it didn't. And they said, well, no, Jesus came spiritually. They had to go back and reinterpret this. And you see even a little bit of reinterpretation in Luke and other places from what Mark originally says. So Jesus says, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Some people who are standing here right now was referring to the people who were with him at the time. This generation will not pass until all these things have taken place. You will not have finished gaping through the towns, or maybe that's, I don't know, gaping going through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So all these seem to imply a very imminent coming, which Jesus may have thought. Now, granted, Jesus said he didn't know when the hour would be, but that's a very strange detail for someone who is God incarnate and knowing it. But it's not surprising for a failed apocalyptic prophet who had a cult following, who people may have misinterpreted and deified later on. That's what we would predict. So all of this is meant to look at the priors and to say that, no, Jesus is not a good candidate. If we're going to pick someone to be God incarnate for someone to perform a miracle through, probably shouldn't start here. And of course, one could point to plenty of other places in the epistles where it seems like the early Christians were expecting this as well. All right, but let's, putting that aside, putting that into our perspective and to compartmentalize that, let's look at the historical evidence now. What is the actual evidence we're looking for the resurrection of Jesus? Well, first of all, the empty tomb apologists will point out a lot, and there's a lot of discussion on this anyway, but one important thing with the empty tomb that one should be mentioned, let me grant for the sake of argument that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. I don't think that the argument that he would be left on a cross or rod is very good, and most scholars don't agree with that. So we can grant that Jesus was probably buried in a known tomb somewhere, but even granting this for the sake of argument wouldn't necessarily help us. There's plenty of stories in ancient Judea, and not just Judea, but in Greece and antiquity, of vanishing bodies. And I have just a list here for people to go and look up if they want. This includes people like Heracles, Chaereas, and Killerhoe, Aeneas, and even some later Christian legends all have stories about bodies going missing. The person comes to where the person is buried, but they can't find the body, and the body has been taken up into heaven. And there's quite a few scholarly articles and writings on this to support this thesis. And so while this doesn't prove that the story of the empty tomb is false, that's in Mark and the other Gospels, it certainly makes us suspicious, knowing that we know this is a literary motif in a lot of other places. And so one would have to have really good evidence to think that this isn't that kind of example. To give another example, we could look at Aristeas. Aristeas suddenly dropped down dead. The report of his death had just spread through the town when a certain individual contradicted the rumor, affirming that he had met Aristeas on the road to Cyzicus and had spoken with him. They went to retrieve all things necessary for the funeral, intending to carry the body away. But on the shop being opened, no Aristeas was found, either dead or alive. 7 years afterwards, he reappeared, they told me, and Proconeus, where afterwards he disappeared a second time. And that's according to the Greek historian Herodotus. And he's hearing the story, I think, second or third hand. But the point is, we have lots of stories about people dying, the bodies going missing, and them appearing to people later on in a glorified state, including, it's interesting that this one mentions a road. That does make one think of Luke 24, the road to Emmaus. Whether there's a literary connection here, who knows? But the point is that this is not necessarily a unique story, and that one can find parallels here. So if one wants to phrase this as an argument, we can say that stories of missing bodies in antiquity are most likely fictional. Premise 2, the empty tomb narrative in the Gospels is a missing body story from antiquity. Premise 3, therefore, the empty tomb narrative in the Gospels is most likely fictional. Now, again, it is possible that the Gospels could be the exception to this rule, but we would need exceptional evidence for this. And if the evidence is at least equal to these other stories, then we wouldn't have any reason to think that they are probably historical. But, let's grant that maybe there is something different. What about the fact that the empty tomb is earlier tradition, right? That this is something that wasn't written down centuries later, but it's in Mark, and perhaps it's implied in Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:4. Regardless, we know that the early Christians proclaimed in Jerusalem, and so people could theoretically go and show the body. Well, this is problematic for a few reasons. Jewish law actually says that you can't identify a body, 3 days or more after it's been decomposed. Quote, you cannot testify to the identity of a corpse, save by the facial features together with the nose. You can testify only within 3 days. So because Jesus was dead, and rose on the third day, and because they didn't even proclaim the resurrection publicly until 40 days later, not only would the body be decomposed, but even if they could somehow identify it, this would not be legal. And so there's no reason to think the Pharisees would try to take this up in a legal court or drag the body through Jerusalem, especially given the extensive cleanliness laws there. So it's unrealistic to think that anyone could just falsify this offhand. And of course, even if people did try to falsify this, even if they did somehow break those Jewish laws and tried to do this, there would still be issues. We could have cognitive dissonance. It could be the case that Christians saw the body and they simply denied. They say, no, that's not Jesus. That is Satan is just deceiving you and has put a veil over your eyes. Or perhaps the Jews switched the body out. We do see accusations of body theft elsewhere. And so Christians may have come up with stories about that to try to defend it because they were so fervent in believing Jesus was raised from the dead. It was not an empty tomb that caused belief in the resurrection, but it was belief in the resurrection that caused belief in the empty tomb. And any evidence to the contrary was seen as false. Paul even applies this in Galatians 1:8 when he says, even if an angel were to come down and tell you, this is a different gospel, here it is, I'm giving you a different gospel, you shall not believe them. So it seems unlikely that Christians were in a state to be disproved, and we're open to criticism here. And in Acts, we don't see hardly any explicit reference to people going to the tomb and checking. So it seems unlikely that this would have really stopped them. And we have examples of this that I've listed, with Sabbatai Sevi. He was a Jewish messianic figure in the 17th century who converted to Islam, and his followers didn't say, oh, he converted to Islam, we were wrong. They said, oh, well, that's not the real Sabbatai Sevi. He was assumed into heaven, and the one who here is a fake. Christians could say the same about Jesus. In fact, the Gnostic Christians said, Jesus wasn't actually crucified. He only made it appear like he was, and they simply denied it. Rabbi Schneerson, who's pictured there, was a Jewish messianic figure and rabbi who died in the 90s. And even then, his followers visiting his grave and his funeral said, even though I see the body there, I still believe that the rabbi lives on in his heart, and I think he will be resurrected soon. I know it, and he still is the Messiah despite him dying, and you'll all see, essentially. And some of them still affirm that 30 years later. So you do have in Jewish context people holding on to these beliefs, really wanting it to be true, and putting aside all evidence to the contrary. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses, which I mentioned earlier with the end of the world. So the point is that often fanatical religious groups don't just admit they're wrong and give up. Usually they double down on their false beliefs and try to rationalize any evidence they can through cognitive dissonance. So it's unlikely that producing the body of Jesus would have convinced them that they were wrong. They would have kept believing. To give a modern example, there's plenty of Elvis sightings. Elvis died in 1977. We know where his body is. His body is displayed publicly. It was buried in Forest Hill Cemetery, but it had to be moved in about a month later just because of privacy concerns. But even though it was moved, and we have pictures of it being moved, you can see in the top right corner there, we also have pictures of the funeral, and we have pictures of the death certificates. Even with all of that evidence, people still later on said they still saw Elvis alive and that the body was fake and that everyone was lying. And so we have a case of a body of a very famous person being dug up and moved and buried in a public place where anyone can go check the grave. And yet we still people saying, no, he's not, that's not him. The body, he's still alive. I saw him. That the body there is a duplicate or fake or whatever. So the point is that digging up a body is not always going to disprove people who are fanatically committed to certain beliefs. So we do have this in the modern day where we have really good evidence. We have photographic evidence. Putting this story 2,000 years ago in an illiterate culture by unknown authors makes this even more troubling to assess. One last thing I'll say on the empty tomb is that even if the skeptic can concede, even if the evidence did point to the tomb actually being empty, that wouldn't necessarily follow that the resurrection is the best explanation. There are modern examples of this happening, and which we are left with a question mark. So, for example, Julie Mott's very sad story. She died in August of 2015, and her funeral service was attended by her family and friends. But a few hours later, when the funeral home workers went to get the body to the cemetery, the body was gone. The grave had been the casket, had been broken into. The picture below is not actually from that event, but the picture above is of Julie. The casket had been broken into and the body was gone. And although there were security cameras there, they did not capture anything in particular, even though the doors had been locked to stop anyone outside of the service from getting the body. It still managed to go away. And so this happened 7 years ago. We still don't have an explanation. There are suspects. Some people think that Julie's ex-boyfriend might have taken the body because he lingered a little bit after the service and was acting a little bit suspicious, but he's never been formally convicted because there's simply no hard evidence to prove that he actually did. And a few months prior to this, the funeral home directors had misplaced another body and were sued for it. But again, there's no evidence that they did this in this case. And so we have to say that we don't really know what the explanation is. But although we can't prove either of those two other hypotheses, it wouldn't be a good explanation to conclude that perhaps Julie did, in fact, rise from the dead and get out of the coffin herself and walked away. That would be astronomically improbable. And although we can't prove the other hypotheses, we can't prove that the body was stolen or misplaced, it's still rational to think that's a more likely option given what we know, because we can't prove it or disprove it either way. And so given this can happen in the modern day with security cameras where there were people, essentially guarding the body with the security aspects they have and locked doors, it's not unthinkable that bodies could be misplaced back then or something could happen to it. And we have to say we don't know what happened to it, but we do know that on rare occasions bodies do go missing for a variety of reasons. And so even if that's granted, we can say that perhaps the body went missing for whatever reason. So it doesn't follow that's necessarily good evidence for the resurrection. All right, let's look at the appearances of Jesus now. So Paul is our earliest witness on this. If we look at 1 Corinthians 15, and although Paul does not go into descriptions of the appearances, he says who saw Jesus. He lists the appearances. That's about it. He doesn't say what they were like. He does drop a few hints that imply that these could be somewhat visionary in those aspects. So Paul talks elsewhere about Christians having visions, whether in the body or in the mind, he doesn't know, when he goes up to heaven. So Paul was frequently having these experiences. Paul says that Jesus is inside of him. He revealed his son in me, that he continues to live in his heart. And Acts 26 explicitly says that this was a vision on the road to Damascus. And Acts describes this as a light that Paul saw and became blind to. So all these little hints implied that what Paul saw may have been some kind of heavenly vision, which we would attribute to hallucinations. And there have been some psychologists who argued that Paul could potentially have had epilepsy. We can't prove or disprove that, but it's not completely unthinkable given that. And so since Paul equates his appearance with the resurrection appearances of the other 12, and that's the earliest account we have, it's not improbable to think that these could have been of the same nature, that when Paul says, I saw Jesus and so did Peter and the 12, that all of them had this heavenly experience of Jesus, and that only later on was this fleshed out, pun intended, in the Gospels. Now, as far as why would Paul have a hallucination? Wasn't he a skeptic? Well, that's true, but there are cases of people converting for strange reasons, although it is fairly rare. Again, it's not unthinkable. And I've got this screenshot from James Fedor's website, if you want to go check that out, on his article on the resurrection. And he gives a list here of hostile people who were very much against a particular religion who ended up converting for a variety of reasons. And so people like Gerd Ludemann have suggested that Paul may have had a guilt complex. Perhaps Paul felt guilty about the stoning of Stephen or persecuting Christians, and that's what opened him up to have these experiences. Again, we can't prove or disprove that because we have so little information about this historically, but it's not improbable, and we do have other examples of this, so it's not hard to draw analogies here. All right, what do we do with the gospel appearances where Jesus is allegedly appearing to groups of people and eating and talking, and it seems very contrary to what Paul has in mind? Well, we have to. What's interesting to note is that the Gospels, at least in this regard, and other places, seem to chronologically get more and more embellished and more elaborate as time goes on, right? And so this is important because apologists will want to say that, well, the Gospels are very reliable, and so if they tell us they saw this and they were sincere, then we should believe that they saw this, right? That we can trust them because they get other details right. This allows us with epistemic routing to be justified in the other details they get right. So, but that works the other way around. If we have good reasons from our background knowledge, I think the Gospels have a habit of either exaggerating or inventing the details and elaborating all this stuff. That hurts our confidence that when they tell us really extraordinary details, like a dead man talking to them, that we should believe them. We should be even more skeptical. So in other examples of this, in Mark, Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist, but as the Gospels get later and later with Matthew, Luke, and John, we see John goes out of his way to say, no, Jesus, you should be the one baptizing me. I'm not worthy. And a lot of scholars think this is because there were competing sects between John and Jesus as far as who was the Messiah. And so the Christians wanted to make sure that John's followers knew that John was submitting to Jesus and that Jesus would never be baptized because he was inferior to John. We see this as well with Jesus having the messianic secret in Mark, tell no one, don't let them know I'm the Messiah, being very subtle. To John, he just flat out says, yep, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God, very explicit with it, to the point where the Pharisees went to stone him. And it's a very big shift of tone In the Gospels, we have Pilate gets more and more innocent. So in Mark, he seems like, okay, yeah, what did Jesus do? And doesn't have that many qualms about punishing him. Whereas by the time I get to, Matthew, his wife's like, no, Pilate, I had a dream. And this man's innocent. Please don't kill him. And Luke, he's like, well, no, I want to have Herod to make sure this man's innocent first. And the Jews really have to twist his arm to get him to do this. And then John, he hands Jesus over to the Pharisees and says, you can crucify him. He hands them over to them. And so Pilate gets more and more absolved from this. And of course, in Matthew, he literally washes his hands and says, I'm not guilty of this man. And so the Christians are shifting the blame from the Romans to the Jews as time goes on in this anti-Semitic kind of trend. And another example is that the burial of Jesus becomes more honorable over time. In Mark, he's buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. He's wrapped up. That's about it. Whereas Matthew, Luke, and in Matthew, it's his own family tomb, and it's by himself, and it's a very nice, rich person's tomb. And in Luke and John, he's buried by Nicodemus, and they get perfumes, they get spices, and it's a very expensive and very royal burial for a condemned criminal. And so we see this elaboration as well. So if the Gospels are willing to do this with other details for apologetic reasons, why not be so much more suspicious when the details in the Gospels on the resurrection also seem to follow a similar trend? For example, again, when Paul gives us the description of the resurrection, he's very vague, doesn't give us details, just says, I saw Jesus, and implies these could perhaps be visionary. In Mark, we don't get any narrated appearances. We only get the angels saying, yeah, Jesus will appear to Peter, but we don't know what that's going to look like, what the nature of that was. In Matthew, we do get a very brief appearance to the women on their way back, and he says, go tell the disciples. And the disciples see Jesus on a hill, in a very mountainous region. It's implied that this is like from a distance, a very wide, large area, and the disciples have lots of doubts. It says some doubted, and then it moves on. It doesn't try to resolve the doubts. For all Matthew knows, they could still be doubting to this day. In Luke, we have angels there, but now the grave clothes are unwrapped. So the body wasn't just stolen, because who would unwrap a body? Same with Matthew, because Matthew also had the guards at the tomb to prevent theft. So we see that the accusation of theft trying to be countered by either the guards or the grave clothes being there. And at this time, the appearance of the disciples happens in an enclosed room, so not from a distance like in Matthew. And it also happens where the doubts are resolved. So in Matthew, they doubt. In Luke, they doubt, but Jesus says, oh, but I can eat and touch me. Now you don't have to doubt. Now they believe. John does a very similar thing with the grave clothes. Again, the grave clothes are neatly folded. Jesus appears to them, resolves their doubts. Thomas says, no, I won't believe. Jesus appears to Thomas. He touches Jesus. He believes. And so we see this theme of explaining away why the body couldn't be stolen, explaining away why the doubts weren't important, explaining away why Jesus wasn't merely a ghost. And we know from people like Celsus that early Christians were being accused of saying ghosts. And so these seem like apologetic, legendary exaggerations being added on in the later Gospels that we don't see in our earlier sources. So given that we know that the Gospels do this in other places, this is the better hypothesis as far as explaining these as legendary and not authentic. But even if we were to take a lot of these passages as written, or at least as some historical core, they're still problematic. As we said, there's a theme of doubt across all of them, and that's really strange. If they're saying Jesus, why are they doubting? And if they saw Jesus and doubted, then how about the people who don't see Jesus and have doubts? How, if the disciples aren't able to overcome this, how else would you be able to as someone who's not seen the risen Jesus? Another issue is that the appearance is really inconsistent. So sometimes Jesus is recognized, like in Matthew 28, no indication he's not recognized there. But in Luke, they don't recognize on the road to Emmaus, and in John, Mary doesn't recognize him. Originally, she thinks he's the gardener. Sometimes he appears a glorious vision from heaven, like he does with Paul, or the Transfiguration, or in Revelation with John, or when he appears to Stephen in Acts or Ananias. But other times he appears just as kind of a mundane, ordinary guy, like in most of the gospel narratives, where he is mistaken for another person. They don't even notice. Sometimes other people can see him, which is implied in like when Paul sees him on the road to Damascus, or the group appearances in the Gospels. But other times he's only seen by one person, like when Ananias or Stephen see him in a heavenly vision. It doesn't imply that other people there can actually see it. It's all in their head. So we get these very inconsistencies. And if this is some kind of hallucination, we would expect these to be inconsistent, to be contradictory. Whereas if this was all from an objective reference, we'd expect more consistency. And so these inconsistencies are evidence against, partially against the resurrection of Jesus. And to go into this next slide, the appearances usually occur in poor conditions. So To show you what I mean by that, Paul doesn't give a specific description of the appearances, so he's not very helpful there. Matthew mentions a brief appearance to the women, and then the appearance on the mountain is from far away. When Luke has it, Jesus is not recognized by the people on the road to Emmaus at first, and then when he appears to the disciples, it's in very dim lighting and evening, with under candlelight when he's eating with them. And then John has Jesus unrecognized from a far distance away, and he's unrecognized by Mary Magdalene. He appears again at night with the disciples when he eats with them. The appearance to Thomas is very brief and doesn't go into much detail. It just kind of cuts off. And then in John 21, which is the picture there, he's seen from a far distance away to where they don't know it's Jesus at first. So although, there are examples where you could say, well, this is a longer appearance, the point is that a lot of these could be mistaken, could be brief flashing moments of uncertainty. And so when we're looking at memory, we want people to recognize the persons involved. Now, the disciples knew who Jesus was. Cleopas didn't know what Jesus looked like, though. And of course, Jesus is also often unrecognized when he is raised from the dead, which is a strange detail. We want long events that are not overly brief. Most of the resurrection appearances from the Gospels seem to be fairly brief and non-descriptive, with the exception of perhaps John 21 and the appearance to the disciples when they're eating. We want proper vantage and lighting. Again, a lot of these happen where they're either from a far distance or in really dim lighting where details can't be determined. We want normally toned situation. There's no adrenaline, stress, or high intensity. Although that does apply to most of the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb does seem to be a very frantic event that people rushing back and forth and confused and stressed about because they don't know where the body is, and that's distressing. So with certain details on that, one can be suspicious. And we want non-mundane events that are worthy of memory. So something that's not mundane. So admittedly, a resurrection would fall under that. But because the resurrection appearances don't fit all of these criteria, these would probably not be admissible in a court of law today. They would be considered, inapplicable. And it's these kinds of testimonies in bad conditions that get people wrongfully convicted on eyewitness testimony. So all of that needs to be taken into consideration. And so when we ask about what about groups of people, can groups of people have hallucinations? Because if one person saw Jesus, that could be explained, but we can't explain how 12 or more, or even 500 saw Jesus. Well, there are group experiences, especially in religious contexts, and group delusions. Marian apparitions, famously Our Lady of Fatima, but you can also look at Medjugorje and some other places where groups of people said they saw the Virgin Mary or some kind of heavenly vision in the sky at the same time. And this is some kind of optical illusion or hallucination or what have you. Same with statues talking, moving. There are stories in ancient Greece about talking statues, and there are actually inscriptions, people saying, we heard the statue talk. We have examples of people seeing statues of the Virgin Mary or Jesus blink or move, and this is seen by groups of people. And usually these have inconsistencies in the stories. Spring Hill Jack, which is pictured in the bottom right corner, was a really interesting kind of example of a mass hysteria in Britain, where in the early 1800s, a woman claimed that she was attacked by a man who breathed fire at her and then was able to leap over a fence, hence the name Spring Hill Jack, because he could jump very high. And once this was reported in the newspapers, everyone started saying Jack. There were witnesses who were in a carriage who saw Jack jump over the roof of a building. There were those saying Jack visited them at night and that he was bringing fire at them. And this got so bad that the mayor of London had to call like a state of emergency. Now, most scholars don't think that Spring Hill Jack actually existed. This was probably some kind of just mass experience. But the point is, these were multiple, polymodal experiences where people said that they could see, hear, and even feel the heat from Jack's breath on them, and this mass sense of panic. And yet this didn't happen. This was all in their head because fear and publicity from these stories. The picture in the bottom left corner is actually a quite funny story from Alabama, of all places, of a group of people claiming to see a leprechaun, and that's the artist's sketch. But you can look it up on YouTube. There's a video of groups of people saying, yeah, we all saw this leprechaun up in a tree, and they seem very adamant about it. So group think and group discussion afterwards can get people to think that they see something that's not there. Same with mass sightings of ghosts, and even group religious experiences in Pentecostal churches where they all feel the Holy Spirit on them at the same time. There's even a pastor who in the 1960s who claimed that Jesus appeared to his whole congregation and walked the aisles, and this was seen by dozens of people in a very strange way. So certainly experiences like this still happen in group settings. And here's an example of Mormonism, of all places, with Joseph Smith, of groups of people being collectively deceived. So this comes from Thomas Ford, who was the former governor of Illinois at the time, who heard this account about Joseph Smith, where he says, Joseph Smith assembled them in a room and produced a box, which he said contained the precious treasure, which was the golden plates. The lid was opened. The witnesses peeped into it, but making no discovery, for the box was empty, they said, "Brother Joseph, we do not see the plates." The prophet answered them, "O ye of little faith, get down on your knees, brethren, every one of you, and pray to God for the forgiveness of your sins." The disciples dropped to their knees and began to pray in the fervency of their spirit, supplicating God for more than 2 hours with fanatical earnestness. At the end of which time, looking into the box again, they were persuaded they saw the plates. So we have here a group of people, after being suggested by Joseph Smith to pray sincerely for 2 hours, finally say, "Oh, we can see the plates now." Groups of people are seeing this, not just one person. So one can use the power of suggestion to make people believe this sincerely. All one has to do in this situation is switch out Joseph Smith for Peter and switch out the disciples for the original apostles. And one can imagine Peter saying, "I saw Jesus, get on your knees and pray, and you'll see him too." And you get plenty of other stories of people now saying, "Oh, now I can see Jesus. Oh, now I can feel the Holy Spirit," etc. We don't know that that's how it happened, but according to Paul, we can't rule it out. And bereavement visions of the dead are pretty common, and a lot of scholars have talked about this, so I'll be pretty brief on it. But there are lots of good resources of this, especially Dale Allison's book on the resurrection has lots of examples of people seeing ghosts, and not just individuals, but groups of people. And sometimes they touch with them, sometimes they have conversations with them. Sometimes they don't even know they're dead until they vanish. Pretty much every combination you can think of in the Gospels. One example, and this comes from James Fedora's book, Unreasonable Faith, example of Samuel Bull. Now, Mr. Bull died in 1931. In 1932, his family moved into his house, and they started seeing Samuel's spirit around them. Originally, this was seen by individuals, but as time went on, they started seeing these in group settings where multiple people were in the room and multiple people could see him at the same time. People investigating this case said that all members of the family together saw the apparition. Whenever the apparition was seen, all the persons were able to see it. Mrs. Bull also noted that her deceased husband spoke to her, so we have conversations. He called her Jane, so we have now not only a visual hallucination of the eyes, but also an auditory hallucination, hearing conversations. And he laid his hand on her brow, and that he was solid when they touched him and quite lifelike. So we have seeing, hearing, and now touching in group settings. And this happened multiple occasions. This actually happened over the period of about a month, about 30 days, and then suddenly stopped, which is very reminiscent of excuse me, very reminiscent of Acts, where Jesus appears in them for 40 days and then suddenly stops and then goes up into heaven, supposedly. So it's interesting to draw the analogies here, where we do have examples of groups of people seeing or hallucinating these, things that are not objectively there, where they are inconsistently seeing them and saying they see the same thing, hearing conversations, allegedly touching them. And this shows how much the power of suggestion comes. If you think, "Oh, I can see him," you can get other people to think they can see him and hear him and all this stuff too. And it's really scary to see what the power of suggestion can do in these situations. The most analogous example I could find is in a Hindu context, an Eastern Asian context, where we have an example of a ghost appearing to people, eating with them and having long conversations. So this comes from the autobiography of a yogi. This was written, I believe, in the 1940s by a known author who is literate, whereas most scholars in the Gospels were written by anonymous authors using stories, second or third hand. So here we have an eyewitness attesting to this allegedly happening. And I won't read all this out, but if you want to pause this and read it, it's basically the story of one of his gurus, one of his yogis, Indian teachers. They're going on a mountainside, and they basically summon his spirit, and his spirit appears to them, and they at first don't believe it's him, but they make a meal together. They sit down and eat with him and touch him, and then after having these conversations, having a meal, he eventually vanishes. And so this is an alleged eyewitness report of this. To my knowledge, I have no reason to think the author doesn't have a good reputation. I have no evidence that he's lying or is dishonest in other places, as far as I'm aware, nor do I know of him having any motive to lie about this. So if it's possible that this was a groupthink hallucinatory situation involving eating, touching, conversing with a dead teacher, it's not hard to think of analogies here, especially since we know this one came from an eyewitness, whereas we don't know that the original gospel authors were eyewitnesses. One final point about the gospel authors and the early Christians being sincere. Often apologists will say, well, all the disciples died, even though some of them will re-note that to say in Sean McDowell's case, Sean McDowell did a book on the martyrdom of the apostles, where we don't actually know that all the apostles died. We know they were at least willing to die, that they proclaimed this and were willing to suffer, but we can only confirm about 4 of them actually did die. But even granting that they were all sincere in their beliefs, that doesn't necessarily prove that they weren't lying. For example, you can die for a a known lie if there is an underlying truth behind it. So an example would be lying to Nazis. So if a Nazi comes to your door and says, "Are you hiding Jews?" and you are, even though you are lying to them and you say, "No, I'm not," you're doing this because deep down you really are sincere in the belief that Jews should not be persecuted, that Jews are people with rights, and that I'm very convinced that these rights should be protected. And so if I have to lie to protect these rights, I will do that. And so people have been willing to go to be punished by the Nazis for such lies that they knew were lies, but they did because they had sincere beliefs underpinning them. And so one could say this with the resurrection. Theoretically, we can't prove this in either way, but it's possible that the disciples really believed Jesus was the Messiah, that he had great moral teachings, and that the only way to get people to believe this, because even Paul says that, well, a crucified Messiah, that's foolishness to us and a stumbling block to the Jews, to say, well, Jesus rose from the dead, and so he was the Messiah. The Messiah didn't actually die. God reversed that decision. And so maybe the disciples were willing to lie about this, and they did this because they really did believe Jesus was the Messiah. They really believed they were doing a good thing, and that the only way they could get this message out is by lying. And so even if they didn't believe he was raised from the dead, their sincere belief that professing this would lead to Christianity spreading could be the catalyst. And so people might be willing to die in that case for a quote unquote known lie. We also have the example I put of Jim Jones, which I think is interesting. Jim Jones was a cult leader in the 1970s. I think he ended up having 800 people killed through drinking poison Kool-Aid because they moved to South America. It's a crazy story, but the short version is that he thought he was some kind of prophet and implied that he was God, and that these people believed him, and that he was, speaking God's word essentially, and he was able to deceive all these people. And he would perform faith healings like a psychic surgery, which an example is down there, where he would allegedly take the tumors out of people and say, "Oh, you've been healed by my power." In reality, he was just using chicken gizzards and tricking people. So the point is, Jim Jones knew that at least part of what he was doing was fake. He knew that the faith healings weren't real, because he can't not know that and also be faking these with chicken gizzards, right? So he would have to know, at least in part, that what he was doing is not legitimate, that he was at least partially a fraud. But perhaps he didn't care. Perhaps he was convinced for other reasons that what he was doing was right to get this group of people together. And he ended up taking them to South America and Guyana, and they all ended up dying, including himself. He could have, said under persecution, well, okay, I made it all up. I'm not really a prophet. I fake my healings, just don't hurt us. But he didn't. He took it to the grave. He stood by what he said. He doubled down, and he ended up taking the poison. And that's kind of the sad thing that happens with people in that state of cognitive dissonance. But this could be a potential example of someone dying for something they know is not true, because they would rather do that than admit they were wrong and take the consequences once they've already gone that far. The last part of this, and the most brief part, will just be, what is the best explanation, right? So can we say that the resurrection is the best explanation given all of this data? Well, even if we were to say, well, the resurrection is the simplest hypothesis, right? Because God raised Jesus from the dead explains all of this, whereas we have to take independent hypotheses to explain this. The resurrection still has lots of questions that are unanswered that don't help with explanatory power. So, for example, Robert Gregory Cavan and others will say, well, how was Jesus seen? Is a resurrected body even made of atoms? Does light reflect off of it or not? Because if we're going to say that it's not made of that, then we can't explain how they see him. And so we don't know the properties of a resurrecting body. We can't really predict what that would look like. How can Jesus eat in the Gospels? He's able to eat after the resurrection. Does he have a stomach and intestines? Why would we need food to eat in the resurrection if we're immortal? Why would we even need food if we don't need food for nutrients and hunger? If we're going to live forever, the whole point of food is to keep us alive. Where did Jesus go when he wasn't with the disciples and between them? He's able to vanish and appear. Was Jesus hanging out on an island somewhere? Was he in heaven when he wasn't on earth? But if he was in heaven, what's the point of the ascension then? And how does Jesus even ascend into heaven if he's in a body? Is heaven a physical place where, God is a body? Because if that's the case, then you get into a lot of questions about contingency and cosmological arguments that presuppose God being this classical theist, disembodied, perfect being without limits. But if heaven's this like physical place where God is an actual throne, that becomes a bit more complicated. And how is Jesus currently in a resurrected body in heaven? And if it's a spaceless place, what does that even look like? How can a physical thing be in a non-physical place? When Jesus appears to Paul after he ascends, is he made of photons? Because Paul sees a light. How does that work? Why is Jesus sometimes recognized and sometimes not? What's going on there? Why does the resurrection hypothesis does not predict that Jesus would be confused and not seen, but the hypothesis that these are hallucinations and spiritual experiences would predict that. You'd expect more inconsistency from these things. And where did the resurrected Jesus get clothes? This isn't mentioned that often, but Jesus was probably crucified naked, and it says that his grave clothes laid on the ground of the tomb. So where does Jesus get clothes? Did he go steal them? That would be problematic for him sinning. Did Jesus go buy them afterwards? That would mean the first person to see Jesus was not the women after he was raised from the dead. Did he just create clothes ex nihilo? Because usually in Hebrew literature, when God does, when angels have clothes or saints have clothes, it's in glory, it's white shining clothes, but Jesus doesn't have that until the ascension. He has regular clothes. So is God just producing clothes ex nihilo? Because we have to add that to our hypothesis. There's nothing in the resurrection hypothesis that says Jesus has to be clothed. He could be theoretically raised naked. So we have to add on to the hypothesis that Jesus is not only resurrected, but has the ability to be seen, has the ability to leave behind an empty tomb, has the ability to be clothed, has the ability to be change his appearance to where he's sometimes recognized, sometimes not, has the ability to eat, because he could have all these things and still not be able to eat. So we have to add on all these auxiliary hypotheses that don't really explain it. A better explanation for all these is just using dream logic. So whenever you're having a hallucination or a dream, you see a lot of weird things that don't make sense. And so you don't usually have to justify, that doesn't make sense. That's weird. I must be dreaming. Usually you just go with it and just accept that it's weird because your brain doesn't question it when you're in those kinds of psychological states. And so if these are just things being seen by people who are hallucinating or dreaming or having visions, they don't really have to explain it. They're just saying, yeah, I saw Jesus in this condition. He was able to. When you think it out logically, it doesn't really make sense, or at least we don't have explanations for it. But if these are just visionary experiences that don't really need to be explained because it's all within the person's psychology and not within the actual world, that's a much better explanation for all of this rather than adding on these auxiliary hypotheses. And of course, background information, even if we grant that God exists, we still have to look at the probability of all the other evidence pointing against this. We do have lots of examples of mythological stories of other gods being resurrected and having missing bodies. We have examples of people seeing dead loved ones, including examples of people in groups and multi-sensory experiences. We have examples of people in group religious experiences and mass hysteria. We have well understood principles that memory can be faulty and eyewitness testimony and what conditions that does apply to. We know that bodies can sometimes go missing for a variety of reasons. We know people do hallucinate. People have dreams. People have religious visions that are not really there. We do know that on sometimes rare occasions, people do convert who were originally hostile to religion for other reasons. We know that people can be sincerely mistaken and die for false beliefs or even lie for other reasons. And so all of this it makes up our background information. So even taking a combination of these requires less auxiliary hypotheses than the resurrection hypothesis does. And so all of this is in our background information, but we don't have any background information on what a resurrected body would look like, what a resurrection body would entail, what predictions we could even make with a resurrection body. So given that we have all these other natural mechanisms, the resurrection is just not a good explanation and doesn't explain the data that we do have. This explains the inconsistency of the appearances. This explains why Paul's appearance seems to be the simplest and John seems to be the most complicated, why we seem to have legendary growth, etc. So one can explain the resurrection through natural means that we have other examples of that's not entirely ad hoc or implausible. So the resurrection just fails as a good explanation. Lastly, hold on, I already said that. Yeah, we don't know the properties of resurrection body and so forth. So I have all that up there. So again, the resurrection is not a simple explanation, nor does it have a lot of explanatory power. The last thing I'll say with this presentation before I wrap up, it's kind of doing a negative altar call. Often when people do apologetics, they end it by saying, here's the gospel, and if you want to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, go ahead. But as the faux skeptic here, and me pretending to be a heretic for the moment, one can do a negative, a anti-altar call in this case. So usually we're looking at evidence, in a court of law, the person is innocent unless they can be convicted beyond reasonable doubt. So my job here is not to say that we can prove the resurrection did not happen. All I'm trying to say is that here we have reasonable doubt, and that if this was a court case, we would not have enough evidence to convict. It could at least at best be open up to say we're not sure either way, but it's possible. It's not so strong that we would have evidence to convict the person with potential consequences. Even Jesus described Christianity as being one of consequences. It's not just a example of past cause wager where we just take it on faith and that we have nothing to lose and that you might as well believe to avoid potential hell. Jesus even said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what would profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? What shall a man gain in return for his soul? So if one is to follow Christianity to the point, and I don't just mean cultural Christians who say, yeah, I believe in Jesus, but I'm still going to live my life how I want, because I don't think most Orthodox Christians count them as legitimate Christians, nor does Jesus. Jesus in other places says, people will come to me and say, oh yeah, I was a follower of yours, and he'll say, depart from me, I never knew you. Jesus wants people to be sincere and to live their lives for him. But in order to do that, that requires a lot of sacrifice. This could be potentially devoting yourself to be clergy, part of a clergy or a missionary if you feel called to do that, or at least supporting people in those cases, giving them money, which could require lifelong vows of celibacy, devotion, poverty, potentially repressing one's sexuality if someone is part of the LGBT community or sexually promiscuous outside of marriage. They require suppressing that and giving up that luxury in exchange for a promise that you don't know might happen, even being single your whole life if you were a priest. Giving part of your income to a church as well as the poor. Now, of course, it's great to help out the poor, but giving 10% of your income is a lot, and certainly people could put that money to better use in often cases. And so if you're supporting institutions that you're not confident that they are teaching things that are in fact true and real, you may be wasting that money that could be put to good use elsewhere. So that's a sacrifice. Living a modest lifestyle free from excessive wealth or monetary success. Jesus repeatedly seems to advocate people being moderately, poor, at least moderately wealthy, but not people having excessive money. So he's saying that, yeah, if you have a lot of money, you should give it away. You should be sincere in that regard. Potentially being willing to die for your faith and given the chance. There's plenty of stories of Christian missionaries, even today, who suffer for their faith and go under horrible torture. And people wasting opportunities for pleasure in this life with hope in the faith reward of an afterlife that's far from certain. We don't know if there's a heaven and all this stuff. So the point is that one does have a lot of risk to take by being a Christian. It's not a simple thing. Even C.S. Lewis, the famous Christian author, said, if you want an easier religion, I would not recommend Christianity. Jesus says the path is narrow. So one better have some really, really, really convincing evidence to dedicate their whole life to this. And all the purpose of this presentation is to show the other side and say, it's reasonable to have doubts. It's reasonable to say that we can't prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, even if it may be true. Is it worth the risks that we're taking here? Is it worth giving up all of that right now in this life that we know exists for something that potentially could be wrong, that we don't have really, really strong evidence for, especially in the absence of hell? So with that, the skeptic may conclude to say that Jesus is probably still dead in that sense. So that concludes the devil's advocate portion of the presentation. Now, with that, I will end that there. I don't mean this to discourage any Christians watching. I mean this only to be constructive criticism, to show you what I would consider to be the best arguments on the other side, and that we really should look at them. And soon I'll be putting up a video to give the other side, to give the Christian's case and to give the best case. And so I'm not trying here to make the apologist feel uncomfortable, nor am I trying to help the skeptic. I'm simply giving both sides of the argument. And I want people to look at this honestly and sincerely and try to put aside their biases, which is hard to do. We all have biases. I'm no exception to that. But I tried in this to be as objective as I could and to represent the other side as fairly as I could, and to show that I think one can be reasonable in denying the resurrection. But as I will argue in the next video, one can also be reasonable in affirming the resurrection and that. So with that, I thank you so much for watching this presentation. And until next time, we shall see the case for the resurrection of Jesus. Until then, salutations.